Maio de 68. Num ano de rebeldia em todo o mundo, o movimento de maio na França se destaca. A maior insurreição popular ocorrida num país de capital. Num ano de rebeldia em todo o mundo, o movimento de maio na França se destaca. O francês promete liquidar o que ficou de maio de 68 na sociedade francesa. E não é muito. A professora de marxismo americana, Kristin Ross, em seu livro sobre maio de 68, mostra como ao longo dos anos a essência do movimento foi sendo desvirtuada e esquecida. O que foi uma greve geral, paralisando um país por 2 meses, na luta contra o capitalismo e contra o imperialismo, virou hoje, na mídia, uma farra de estudantes em busca da liberação sexual. Kristin Ross recebeu o milênio em sua casa de campo, ao norte de Nova York, para falar do legado de maio de 68.
In your book, you show how, over the years, the representation of what May 68 was changed. What were the main changes?
68 was essentially transformed into its own opposite in the course of about a 10-year period between 1978 and 1988, which is to say between the 10th and the 20th anniversaries. And for example, every single television documentary or news footage that was shown in 78 began with the Third World, with images of the Third World, with Africa, with even Palestine a little bit, Cuba, China, all, in other words, creating an international and a global context for what occurred in France.
Vietnam too.
Well, Vietnam is never mentioned in the 1988. It's completely erased, and Vietnam is obviously the most important contextual element. And so what happens instead is a gradual replacing of Vietnam, which is to say the tropes of anti-imperialism, the critique of the United States and the war in Vietnam, a gradual replacement of that with a thematic of sexual liberation. So the thematic of sexual liberation is what dominates the 1988 commemorations. Again, if you go back to 1978, the narrative always would start, you'd have the international context, you'd have the Third World, and then you would have the rock thrown through the American Express window during an anti-Vietnam demonstration. And that would be the déclic, you know.
There are also those who say that 68 was a shock of modernity, that May 68 pushed France away from, traditional old systems and into modernity.
Well, that you see not just in the French context, but that is used as a kind of way in which the transformation, and you hear this a lot, people will say, well, it wasn't really a political event, it was a cultural event. And what they mean by culture is something like transformations of la vie quotidienne. When in fact, if you go to Norway or you go to any a country that really had no substantial cultural, political upheaval in the 1960s, those things would still be true. So what's being attributed to May 68 is what would have happened anyway in terms of sort of capitalist modernization, and you can see that if you look at any other modernizing Western countries. So I think it's an attempt to really to surgically remove the political aspects of people's memory of what a certain kind of left sociability and left solidarity was really about.
You mentioned the sociologists who actually say that nothing happened in May 68.
Yes. The first person to do this with great aplomb was Raymond Aron. He was the initiator of this in a book that he wrote as the events were happening, and he was, the voice of sheer panic among the elite as they looked at this, and he compared the students' in the French university system to rats. And he said, this is what happens when rats become overcrowded. And I think that one of the problems with 1968 and the analyses that surrounded it, which was really the subject of my book, to look at what people have said, is that the historians disappeared. I mean, it was the largest mass movement in French history. It was the longest and most significant strike in the French labor movement. And it was the only sort of general insurrection that the overdeveloped world has known in recent times. So it extended into, you know, cultural workers. It extended into the media workers. It affected everyone from shipbuilders to department store clerks to, you know, old people. Every village in France was touched in some way by this event. The people on the streets in '68 were people whose childhood and whose young adolescence, the background noise were all of de Gaulle's police and the OAS and the bombings in Paris and all of the different kinds of what people could experience about the ending of the Algerian War, which was an enormous conflicted time, and that was what people grew up with. So I didn't think that it was really possible that there could be no connection.
So what happened was that we could say that French people went to the streets to try to topple a very repressive police state. Is that correct?
Well, I think that was part of it. I think that they knew what the Gaullist regime could do with their police. They saw that in the early 60s. Vocabulary, it's very interesting that you have a word like ratonnade, you know, which was used about in say October 1761, or any of those moments when the police would target the FLN in Paris or various Algerian demonstrations. And then you see that word migrate up into, you know, the hunting down of students in the streets in '68, and that's also called ratonner.
And matraquage.
And matraquage, the same
Matraque
exact.
is an Arab word, right?
Yes, yes.
What does it mean?
It means club, but it was only, you know, it's a moment of semiotic interest, because it's only in '68 that you have the word taking on a kind of metaphorical dimension as well. So it begins to veer off into that kind of metaphorical dimension at that point, but it retains its kind of colonial etymology, which comes from the Arab word meaning club, matraque.
Another thing that was obscured and forgotten in your show is the level of police violence, the level of state violence that actually happened.
One thing I did was I went and I sat through every video footage, documentary and newsreel footage that I could find. And I was completely shocked by the level of violence, because I too had been, you know, swayed by this image, an earlier image of an official discourse about '68 being gentle and poetic, and what I saw was something not that far from, you know, the Japanese, the Zengakuren, you know, who would go in fully armed against the police. I mean, these street battles in the streets of Paris were incredibly violent, and that's another thing that, again, you know, you could see that kind of footage on French television in 1978, but in 1988 it was gone.
It's interesting that you found some of the best narratives of May '68 and the whole period in detective stories.
I was concerned with looking at how 68 was represented subsequently, and what I found was that there was absolutely no impression whatsoever, no effect at the level of high literature. You know, you couldn't really find anything of interest in terms of an attempt to really come to terms with the kind of distinct and specific political culture of those times. Which is to say that if it enters into a kind of plot or narrative, it enters in the form of an individual character's existential angst with barricades in the background, or, you know,
like in Bertolucci's film.
Exactly. But what I did find, and I was initially surprised by this, was that throughout the roman policier in France, you could see very, very clearly an attempt to recall in a serious fashion those moments, and also to deal with the question of what happens when those moments are forgotten. In other words, what is the effect on the present when something like the Algerian War or 68 recedes from memory. And at first I was puzzled by this, and then I realized that, of course, you know, all of these authors that I was reading, like Denings or Jean-François Villers or Jonquet, were in fact themselves militants, mostly Trotskyists, and they had all just transformed themselves into detective writing in the 1970s and 80s, as had a number of editors. I would say it's around in the late 70s, for the first time, if you go into a bookstore in France, the number of shelves devoted to detective fiction were on a par with the number devoted to so-called serious, to belles lettres.
And there's a parallel between investigating a crime and investigating something that is now hidden and forgotten, like May 68.
And what I find fascinating among these writers is that they frequently use a technique whereby you have two different historical eras on top of each other, so that the 60s are the buried eras whose burial has caused a kind of an effect onto, say, the 1980s. I'll give you an example. You might have forgotten moments of the Algerian War rising up again in southern France in the 1980s in the form of sort of semi-fascist behavior, you know, so that the forgetting of these things has a criminal effect on the present. And it's a very interesting technique, you know, and it's not, I've done some studies of certainly of American and British and Italian detective fiction, and it's only the French that are really at this point engaged in this kind of historical resuscitation of the recent past, you know, the past that people lived through and are still alive to think about.
Let's talk about prominent 68ard, who is now the French foreign minister, Bernard Kouchner. In his history, his trajectory, what it shows about the change in the image of 68?
Kouchner has his exact kind of equivalence in the United States. I'm thinking of people like Paul Berman, or, you know, people who were on the left for about 5 minutes and then very, very quickly began to reconstruct themselves. And so I've been fascinated by Kouchner in that sense, and I think that he was very much present in the 1988 commemorations. He's good looking, you know, photogenic. They put him up there on television at each of the commemorations, and he becomes the one of the the perfect sort of talking heads to, based on his reliance on the discourse of personal experience, his own experience, he then gives himself, and the media grants him, the ability to completely define what in fact went on retroactively, according to whatever he thinks now. The larger analysis that I wanted to make him the emblem for has to do with the way in which that discourse of human rights was used, particularly in France, very specifically to repudiate the memory of May 68. And it has to do with two different kinds of third worldism. And you see this very clearly on the television shows that Kouchner was on in the 80s, where he'll say, we were just navel-gazing in 1968. We were narcissists. And then, 15 years later, we discovered the third world. And what he means by that is the third world of, victims of droughts and floods and totalitarian states and all of that. When in fact, Kouchner himself went to Cuba to interview Fidel Castro in the early 60s. I mean, there was a third world that was very much a part of his own and other people's political imaginary. But he wants to erase that one and really replace it with a third world where, in my view, people in distant places are then cast as either a victim or some sort of barbarian.
And what about all those nouveaux philosophes and other former 68ards who became media intellectuals and repudiated Marxism, discovered the Gulag, discovered the Soviet Union, and discovered the dissidents?
They cast their conversion narrative, because that's what we're talking about. These narratives that all begin with a phrase like, I was blind but now I see, or I was duped and now I see clearly, I've found my lucidity. That chorus, which began again in around 1976 with the entry onto the scene of the nouveaux philosophes, who many of were ex-68ards, that chorus was cast as a repudiation of Marxism, and yet I think that it was much more actually about repudiating their own disillusions and frustrations about May. So they cast it on a huge world historical scene, their encounter with the Gulag. But in fact, it was really much more about something going on in their own, in their own political life that was much closer to home. But it's only now, I think, was very interesting, because that, what we could call that anti-totalitarian so-called left, really held sway for a long, long time in France, and I think it only now are people able to see their way beyond that. And I think that the strikes of 1995 were very important as of loosening up that that hegemony of this anti-totalitarian left.
Yes, because then they were against the strike, right?
They were all against the strike, and then many of them went on to be supportive of the American invasion of Iraq, like Kouchner.
Guy Hockenheim has an analysis of these converted former 68ards as having a problem with a crisis of masculinity. What is that?
Well, Guy Hockenheim wrote one of the most amazing books about the memory of 68. I don't know if it's available in Portuguese, but even the title is funny. It's called An Open Letter to Those Who Traded in Their Mao Collars to Become Rotarians. So he wrote this book, but he was also one of the foremost gay theorists in France, and gay activists and militants, and so his ability, I think, to analyze certain kinds of masculinist behavior on the part of his former comrades was perhaps more acute because of his being gay. Hokingham thought that they suffered from these former comrades who had converted to liberalism in the French sense, had suffered from a kind of crisis of masculinity that meant that they had to compensate for their conversion by showing that they were still very, very tough, and they could then advocate, bombing or, adopt a kind of militantly warrior sort of stance.
What is the parallel between May 68 and all the matraquage at that time and the police violence against immigrants that happened recently under Sarkozy in France?
Yes, I mean, there is a parallel at the level of the state, but I'm not sure that there's a parallel at the level of the people, because it seems as though in the past, one of the interesting things about 68 was that it was the very first time that the immigrant, the immigré, emerged as a distinct political subject. And much more work has to be done on this, but up until that point, really, the left, the parties, had ignored immigrants because they couldn't vote, and so what good were they? There had been no real attempt to organize them until '68, when people, again, these militants, student militants, often would make these very significant physical displacements out to the foyer immigré in the midst of their organizing against the Vietnam War, and before that against the Algerian War. So you had a kind of politicizing of the figure of the immigrant, and very soon after '68, it was in the early '70s that for the first time you have, squats and immigrants actually, determining their own kind of political agenda and subjectivity. Now, something has to be done to sort of trace that genealogy, but I don't think that right now there's the political context isn't really quite there for what's going on in the banlieue, even if the state repression remains the same.
Thank you.